It's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about whole of community engagement. Again, I'll be brief in the context setting around this so that we can get to some of the findings. But to start off with, again, I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and that we recognise their strength and resilience. The first thing I want to say is that whole of community engagement was a team effort. It's certainly not the James and Donna show, and it never has been, never will be. It draws on team experience and multiple voices that were shared across this particular project. To give you a little bit of background, it was a very large initiative that was funded as a result of the Berendt Review in a special HEP funding round back in 2013. The funding started flowing in 2014. The project took off in late 2014 operationally and essentially continued throughout 2015 and 2016. It then continued into 2017 with a bit of a strategic focus because the funding was drying out, and certainly by 2018 the funding had gone, which is why there's no community-based researchers up here presenting this work today, which would certainly be a preference. It was underpinned by a partnership approach, and so in particular it was Bachelor Institute, were heavily involved, CDU, Northern Territory Government through the Department of Education, and NAILSMA, the North Australian Indigenous Land Sea Management Alliance, were all involved. It involved working across 6 remote communities, of which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of the aim, it was to work with specified remote Indigenous communities across the NT to build aspiration, expectation and capacity to participate in further education. So it was around really having discussions with these 6 remote communities around what was required, etc. The 6 communities, that's okay.
Sorry, I was thinking I can't see, but standing over there is not good.
Here we go, we'll move up this way a little bit more. So there were 6 communities, Yutakala, Galawinku, Gumbalanya, Menangrida, Tennant Creek and Yuendamu that we worked across. Interesting, just to show you some of the public discourse around whole of community engagement. We had a project brief that we wrote up. One was at 7th of 9th of October. We took that out to Yuendamu to start discussions about what this is about. By 16th of November, Sunday Canberra Times were saying that the whole initiative was a waste of time, less talk, more action type thing. But actually we were out there talking about action and what was required. Which, as you can see, by end of 2015-16, we're starting to see that picked up with the media in terms of the work that we were doing and why that was important. Everything is on the whole of community engagement website. Because of the partnership approach, it isn't housed on the CDU website. We wanted to make sure that this wasn't a project about CDU. This was actually a project around remote Indigenous students, and we felt very passionate about that. So all of the things that we'll be talking about today, you can go to that website and find information. What we're talking about today is sort of a distilled version of this. So these were the evaluation reports that were done for each of the sites. So you'll see 6 reports there for each of those communities. That was distilled into a final evaluation report, which was the thickest damn evaluation report for a project of this nature that I've seen. But part of that was showing that there were such diverse views and issues and community-centred actions that these communities wanted to support them to participate in higher education. But because it was so dense, we gave some of our final the final portion of funding that we did have, we put towards developing some evidence briefs around these issues here. So this is really condensing all of the evaluation recommendations, if you like, into what does this mean? And we're going to talk through each of those today. I'll present some and Donna will present some as well. But what I did want to say is this document here, again there's copies over there and you're welcome to take one, is a copy of those evidence briefs. So if you go through there you will find the 10 evidence briefs that we're talking about today in that document. So let's start off by the first one, taking a mutually respectful approach to practice. In terms of background information, when we went in, we knew that, you know, genuine local engagement was important and that we needed to privilege Indigenous voices. Key messages that came out of the whole of community engagement initiative were that Indigenous leadership is important, and certainly we had a raft of Indigenous community-based staff that were involved in this particular initiative. Another key message is that we need to acknowledge both Western and cultural intersections. So it's not that one's right or wrong or the other's right or wrong, but it's actually the intersections between those that is the really hard thing to navigate. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we go through. That it takes time to build trust was another one as well, and that's really important in the context of this initiative. It was a big initiative and it was going at a cracking pace, and I would have dearly have loved to have had probably the same amount of money and done this over a 10-year period than over a 2-year period operationally. Considerations for policy and practice. Again, what we heard was that place-based responses are important, and I would the data is telling around that, and we also need to think about both systemic versus community imperatives. So there's issues that are within the university context that we need to deal with, but there's also issues at the community context that we also need to deal with to be able to support remote Indigenous students to participate in higher ed. A few examples of some of the publications that have come out. Again, I think there's some copies of those over there as well. But I guess just to make it clear that we didn't just see this as a program, we saw this as an applied research project, if you like, or initiative. There was a combination of doing stuff on the ground that was very action oriented, but also making sure that we were distilling the evidence into those academic formats where we know that it will get picked up in policy context moving forward. Forming partnerships with impact. Again, Indigenous community engagement is it's quite a vexed issue. There are lots of different perspectives about this, but we do know that local partnerships are important. We also know that in the Indigenous higher ed space that intersectoral partnerships are really important. This isn't just a conversation about education, that this is a conversation about employment, it's a conversation around health, it's a conversation around land management, etc., etc. Key messages from whole of community engagement: shared goals and aspirations, and that partnership and coordination needs resourcing. So whilst there was a high level of interest among people involved in the project to work in partnership, they often said, we don't have time, who's gonna support that partnership approach? So resourcing that is particularly important. In terms of other things that we found, external partnerships were also really important within this process as well. So I talked about the main partners that we had, but partnering with local government in this space, partnering with schools was really important throughout this project as well. And that higher ed partnerships can actually take many forms. They don't need to be the partnerships that we might logically think of around those sort of higher ed school partnership arrangements, that actually higher ed institutions can be forming innovative partnerships with employment agencies or different workplaces or different organisations and Aboriginal community controlled organisations within that as well. Building parental engagement with formal education. I think this is yours. Yep.
Okay. So I guess out of this, one of the key questions that we kind of want to ask is, in what ways do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents want to engage in schools, and how is this facilitated by school systems? So sometimes, certainly the voice of Aboriginal parents in community was that they want their children to achieve, and they want them to go on and be the many different things that everybody else wants for their children. And I guess that there's some tension around that, because in terms of that, I guess one of the key points in that is that there's an invisibility that happens, but it's not without care. And so the big question, the question that you have to ask through all of this is, in what ways do they want to engage? And that's a question that needs to be asked repeatedly in the schools and in the education, particularly in remote community. So I think one of the big issues with that is that there is sometimes a revolving door of staff, and that question is sometimes forgotten to be asked. And so that question needs to be asked on a yearly, on a semester, on a term basis, so that we're continuously asking that question. And I guess it comes back to perhaps some of the things that we're going to come to later is around those culturally safe spaces that we're, that schools can and need to be. And part of that, from my own perspective, is how open are schools. And when you go to communities, the schools open at 8 o'clock and the gate locks at 3 in the afternoon, and then it opens up again at 8 o'clock. This resource that is sitting in the middle of the community is really underutilised. So it's a place that we need to think about carefully. And I guess that builds on to the next part, which is about providing culturally safe environments. And I think to bring out some positive stories that we saw within this project was that there are a number of schools. Schools were one of the highest employers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the communities. And in terms of that, then from the janitor all the way through to the principal, there is opportunity for creating culturally safe and inviting and inclusive places. And what does that mean? I guess it means that in actual fact, the janitor is also included in professional learning and professional development, and the idea that that is just a pathway to what else that they would want to do. So the idea of culturally safe spaces in education is that education is offered within that space to everybody, and everybody's learning together, and you're building a framework around, I suppose, developing and learning new knowledges from multiple perspectives as an aspect of being able to create a space that is educationally driven without being overt in that drive, I guess. So the next one is employing culturally competent teachers and principals. Certainly within the Department of Education, I've gone to a number of days where we've had teachers who are new to the territory coming into what do they call it? The induction. They have an induction, a 3-day induction, and probably out of that 3-day induction, maybe 1 hour is given over to being culturally knowledgeable or understanding cultural inclusivity, and it's a limited time. And I guess in terms of that, if we're really going to be thinking about providing culturally responsive education settings, then that time needs to be broadened out. And for pre-service teachers, I was lucky enough to work in the teaching schools in the School of Education, and when I came through university, you could actually do a whole course around teaching and working in remote communities, and part of that was that you went out numerous times to remote communities to actually meet people, and not just to the schools, but to meet leaders and to really see what you were going to get into when you were working in a remote location. And for me it was really interesting because I was an Aboriginal person doing a course around working in Aboriginal and remote schools, and going and meeting other Aboriginal teachers working in those schools. And it was a really interesting space to be in, particularly because you were able to actually talk to all your colleagues and all your other students around what cultural education and cultural knowledge was how it impacted on how you saw the course, I guess, which was a slightly different perspective from someone talking from the outside. And I guess in terms of that, having more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these courses, then they're going to be able to give and share their perspectives, and that's going to bring a whole new element to this idea of cultural competent teachers and principals.
I think yours is the next one too.
Mine's the next one. Thanks, James. So, incorporating Indigenous curriculum and pedagogy, I guess it's how knowledge is presented. And for me, the big question in this is there one way to present knowledge? And how is knowledge assessed? And what knowledge is being judged? And I guess in terms of this, we have a history in Australia, having a look at work that has come out of South Australia, work that has come out of Queensland and Western Australia. We have a whole database of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working on curriculum and unpacking curriculum and putting together, and the Northern Territory, putting together packages around how Aboriginal knowledge and Western knowledge work side by side. And I guess the question is, where are those curriculum documents and how are they used in schools, in education systems, and how can that then actually move into the higher education sector for how we present knowledge, what knowledge is privileged, and then how that knowledge is judged. I think it's still a big question to be asked.
The next one is around investing in English language literacy and numeracy, and I'd really like to acknowledge the work of Alison Stewart, Fiona Shelley, and a whole range of other people that did some strategic work throughout the project in this space. What we know that LLN skills provide a basis for ongoing education. We also know that there's been limited policy attention to that space, and when there has been a focus on the policy space, tends to be around LLN for employment as opposed to LLN for ongoing education. What we found is that this issue of English language literacy and numeracy was coming up repeatedly. This was one of the topics that was very consistent across all 6 communities that we were working in. But actually we didn't have a good solid evidence base to say what the issue actually was within the NT. It was very anecdotal, if you like. Everybody said it was an issue, but it wasn't. It hadn't been justified in any way. So part of whole of community engagement was around trying to provide that evidence base. So we did a statistical overview, which Fiona led with Alison as well, to show that is an issue, and certainly it is a challenge within the remote area, as you can see there. We know that it's important for lifelong learning, but there's another important message there. Rather than just to problematise LLN as a deficit, as something people don't have, that actually the narrative there is around LLN in tandem with local Aboriginal languages, because those local Aboriginal languages were also extremely important to all 6 sites in the studies as well. So it's not one or the other, it's both, and it's around how they work together. But certainly understanding that English LLN is critical for pathways into higher education was important. As part of that work, which was very action-based, it was around implementing the LLN action statement. So there's a statement, it's up on the website, around what some of those actions might be moving forward. And there's a strong argument there around sustainable resourcing. There's a copy of the statement on the left-hand side, a copy of the workshop that led to the statement on this side as well, as an example of some of the work that went on in that space. Another one that came out was this notion of intercultural education practice and what that looks like. And we've already sort of touched on that, but this is going a little bit deeper, and certainly in terms of what we were hearing, it was beyond both ways. So that this notion of both ways learning is really important, but it's actually unpacking the interconnected between Western and Indigenous knowledge system, the negotiating and that nexus. What does that mean? And Martin Nuckett has written quite a bit around that work as well. Some of the key messages is the need to share insider-outsider perspectives, and we're in a unique a unique context where we had Indigenous community-based staff, and we had both Indigenous and non-Indigenous outreach staff working with those staff as well, that were not forced, very willingly worked together and negotiated in this space quite well, where they shared that information. We found it tricky to negotiate, and that goodwill and creativity was required in many respects for that.
Lots of laughter.
Lots of laughter, lots of laughter. But that at the end of the day, that self-determination and control are really central features of that. So we need to be looking at where does the power still lie after those conversations, is really critical. I guess getting to the crux of it from a policy and practice perspective, that interculturality needs to be prioritised by the Department of Education as an area for action, and that all teaching staff and principals must be sensitive to intercultural intersections. So that 1 hour in an induction process isn't enough. It needs to go much deeper than that, and it needs to be continuous and involve reflective conversations over an ongoing period of time. Mobilising Indigenous leadership and governance. I think this is fairly self-explanatory, and I won't go into a lot of detail here other than to say that if we want to see change, it needs to be led at the local level by local leaders. In terms of what did happen through whole of community engagement, we did have a collective school council gathering that we held over in Yirrkala, where we brought Indigenous representatives from seven school councils from across from those regions. In Tennant Creek, they had both primary school and high school Indigenous representation on schools, 2 separate school councils, to talk around what does this look like. And this, so they came up through that process. I'll skip ahead one with this collective school council statement on remote Indigenous education. Again, all those dot points down there, this is on our website as well, has some key actions that can be implemented. So very practical things that either the Department of Education or schools can do to mobilise Indigenous leadership and governance. A strong one being involving Indigenous youth in leadership discussions moving forward as well. I also want to go back one though and say, I mentioned before our Indigenous community-based researchers, which we actually ended up referring to as our Indigenous community-based leaders, because this is a selection of those people. It's not everybody, but amazing people. Many of these people that were employed through the program also sat on their school councils, sometimes as chair or deputy chair of those school councils, and or had been working in the education system for many, many years. I think probably Jeffrey and Valda were in the vicinity of 30 years. Same with Yaume. She completed her Bachelor of Education as one of the probably most prominent bilingual linguists in Australia and educators. And then you had people like Dean, who were starting up a remote school in a very remote location as well, the Nawattakan Academy as well. So some people with amazing experience.
He recently won a sustainability award through his work in
land management. So he's an amazing person, but it was a real privilege to work with these people that were part of the whole of community engagement family. Supporting mentoring for Indigenous students. I guess a few things to mention here, that locally specific mentoring is beneficial, makes sense. If you've got local mentorship happening, that people have got better opportunities to succeed. And the photo there is of the, might be 2 years ago, the graduates, Year 12 graduates from Goombalanya, so one of the sites. And I noticed it on social media last night that they just had their graduation again this week as well. But it's one school that's continued to have Year 12 graduates year after year after year. Education and career pathway. The mentoring can relate to a whole range of things. It can be around education, it can be around career mentoring, it can be around mediation, solving through problems that are stopping access or participation in education, and also academic mentoring as well. And that mentoring is one of those things that can potentially have a significant impact on engagement and attendance, and that actually we might want to start thinking about that in terms of the way that we measure work in that space. But certainly Department of Education should be looking to invest in community-led mentoring initiatives, and universities can also partner in mentoring activities, and there's some universities that are doing this quite well at the moment. Some that are involved in national programs like AIM, others that are doing it at a more local level that's negotiated with certain organisations. Also wanted to touch on the Remote Indigenous Youth Leadership Summit that was held as well throughout whole of community engagement, which brought 30 plus youth together to talk around Indigenous youth leadership and to think about mentoring in that space as well. And the last one is maximising the contribution of local Indigenous teachers, and I think that's over to Donna for this last one.
Yep. I guess in terms of this, it's the recognition of the long history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the education sector, and some of the history of the programs that have been developed to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into teaching. And I guess in terms of this, one of the things that I really want to kind of talk about is the fact that we often talk about Aboriginal people, and we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a homogenous group. And I guess the thing to remember in that, when we're thinking about the context of intercultural knowledge and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems, is that Aboriginal people themselves see themselves as separate cultures. So we are Bini people, we are Yolngu people, we are Tiwi people, we are people from the land in which we come from. And each of those places holds its own culture and its own way of thinking, being and doing. And I guess in terms of that, ensuring that we maximise the contribution of local Indigenous teachers is actually celebrating the fact that those people hold the knowledge for the area that they come from. They hold the education that is being imparted to their children both inside and outside of school. And I think that's a really important aspect of the work that we did, and a strong voice that came out around that localised knowledge and how that needs to be supported and implemented and practiced, and the fact that that might look different in each different location. And therefore the privileging of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers in those schools, the Bini teachers, the Tiwi teachers, is a vital part of that development of curriculum and knowledge and education for those students, and that there's a long history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in those spaces. And I guess just in terms of that, Therese, if you don't mind me asking, would you tell us a little bit around the Growing Your Own program and the success of that?
Hi, I'm Therese Kirsten from the College of Education. We've been involved in a program called Growing Our Own for 10 years now. And basically what that is a very strong partnership with the Catholic Education Office and ourselves at the university, based on their Indigenous teacher assistants becoming teachers in their communities. We work in only their remote Indigenous communities. So we work in Daly River, Tiwi Islands, Wadeye, Senator Reason, thank you, and Catherine, we sort of regard as regional/remote. Currently we've had 30 graduates as teachers. This last year we had 20 students enrolled, continuing to complete their degree in education. I've been hearing wonderful things coming through the research that I'm sitting here going, yeah, I know this, I know this, I know this, because what I know is that it's an individual-based program that we run. Donna talks about teachers from Tiwi, teachers from different areas, and they have their own cultural beliefs, but within each of those communities, the way this program has been able to be successful is that we've done it individually, student by student. For example, student from Wadeye, her father passed away, she had to have a reasonable gap in her learning because of that, but that didn't impact upon the other students in Wadeye in that program at the time. So apart from doing community by community, we've had the absolute privilege of doing student by student. I also manage a large course here at the university, and I don't know all those students, but I can tell you every name of every student that came through the Growing Our Own, because we did it individually. And that took into account that cultural differences between communities, between students, and that enabled them to feel safe working with us. And we work in the multimodal because we can. And our multimodal isn't like, I know Bachelor has their time where the students come in. Ours fits the student. It's a very luxurious way to be able to assist and walk with these people through their undergraduate degree. And I feel extremely privileged to have worked with this project for so long, delivering on the island as well as managing it. And Mandy here has been our amazing administrative person that has enrolled. And I want to say to all those researchers out there, come and talk to us, because we actually skew your research, I'm sorry, because all our students are listed here as their address, because we manage their payments through Catholic Ed that fund their study. So our students are not listed as a Tiwi Island student or a Wadair student. They're actually listed here, and Mandy gets all their emails and unfortunately surveys that she doesn't respond to. So I'm sitting here thinking, oh my goodness, if you could come and talk to us, we could enrich your research incredibly. Because our 30 odd graduates and our current 20 enrollees are not truly represented in what you've been talking about today. So please come and see us in the College of Ed. And we'd be more than happy to add to this, but it's wonderful seeing it. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I think we also skew the data in terms of the outcomes. I haven't got the numbers in my head, but our completion rates are very high and our retention rates are very high. In fact, they're above the average for CDU students.
Yes.
They're really high. It's very successful in terms of those kinds of outcomes. The other part of the equation is it's relatively expensive compared to other approaches as well. So there are other ways to address some of the issues that we've had earlier today.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to come in after that and say, for the skeptics in the room, an individualised approach is very expensive. But if you were to do an economic cost benefit analysis on this stuff, and you looked at what was spent on recruitment to teachers in remote regions across the NT, I suspect that you'll find that it's very good bang for buck at the end of the day. And it's not just about the finances, it is about some of the stuff we've been talking around today, around Indigenous leadership, cultural knowledge, Indigenous knowledges, etc. So there's these bonuses, these value adds to
and
doing work in different ways.
The biggest value add has probably been to our staff here, who have gone out and delivered in community, who haven't had the opportunity before. But talking about financial, I mean, a lot of people are very dollar focused. The outcomes speak for themselves. However, if you look at someone who's in the Department of Defence and gets put through an undergraduate degree course, it's cheaper. So it's not an outrageously expensive thing. And when you look at our results, it's far more viable.
But it does.
I think when we were first working on that and looking at how we were working, it had an impact on the School of Education into how we thought about the next reiteration of the course and how assessments and assignments might actually work. So there were a lot of learnings that came out of that.
So over our 10 years, not only has the project developed, but it's actually impacted enormously on when we've had reviews of our own courses within this College of Education and how we can accommodate that and be more flexible.
And I guess I want to also highlight that in side by side with that were a number of other programs that weren't as successful, but also that generally speaking, quite often Aboriginal teacher education pathways are quite elongated people quite often go through this idea that let's do a Certificate 2 course, let's do a Certificate 3 course, let's do a Certificate 4 course, and that will prepare them for higher education. And I think the outcomes of the Growing Your Own program, which starts as an undergraduate degree and supports people to complete, there are lots of benefits and learnings around having a pathway that is not so elongated.
Just thanks for that, and that's precisely the reason why we're having the forum today, is to start to have these conversations, and I'm hoping that we can continue those throughout the lunch break and into the networking session and panel discussion this afternoon. But just to bring this presentation to a close, I guess after presenting all of this, something that I wanted to say was that what this presents is opportunity for system change. So right at the beginning I mentioned that there's these systemic issues that need to be addressed, but there's also community issues. Much of what we've addressed here is the community issues and how we can engage better with the people in the remote communities that we're working with. But there's significant opportunities for system change, and I think from a CDU perspective, but I think Bachelor Institute as well, are very well poised to respond to some of the recommendations coming out of this research. At CDU we've got Connect, Discover, Grow, which Simon spoke about this morning. We've got a CDU Vet Strategic Plan as well. We've been doing some partnership development. I think there's probably more room to do more in that space. There have been some examples of valuing cultural knowledge, but again we can do better in that space, and certainly thinking about our Indigenous academic workforce is important, and we've got another presentation around that later today. And definitely, and I say this from a program management perspective, and I know that one of my colleagues, Aurelie, if she was here as well, would say that there's huge opportunities to change some of the administrative and HR systems and practices within CDU in this space as well, and that cuts across travel, procurement, employment, IT, the list could go on and on. I think that there was maybe 42 recommendations made around system changes in the final evaluation that could have made us being able to do this project better, but also to have remote Indigenous students engage and participate in higher education more easily. On that note, I would like to do a final funding acknowledgement to the Australian Government, the Department of Education and Training, and HEP, from which this program was funded. It was certainly an experience. We hope that we've built an evidence base that can be used practically moving forward. And we certainly know that there's communities out there that have got a deep interest in the findings from this, and to see action emerging out of it.